Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd. We are beginning a new study in the book of First Kings, chapter 1. Now, I've titled this devotional David's Dying Bequest and Adonijah, the Usurper. I invite you to look with me at this wonderful historical book. Well, as we begin our scripture reading today, we are introducing the first of two books by the name the Kings. Now, as its name implies, it is a study of the kings of Israel and Judah. Now, our study of King David's life will conclude with an introduction to the post-Davidic era in Israel's history. Consider then First Kings, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Here we have David and the frailty of old age. So the opening verse of First King introduces a leadership transition in Israel. We read in verse 1, Now David was old and stricken in years. Now we find the mighty King David, whose exploits were celebrated in song and in the scriptures, now old and frail and lying on his deathbed. Now, although not culturally appropriate today, David's servants, in a desperate effort to provide physical warmth for the king's failing body, suggested that a young woman be found to share his bed, verses 1 and 2. Well, David agreed to the idea, and we find that a beautiful young virgin named Abishag, a Shunammite, was brought to the king in verse 3. Now, although she attended to the king, the scriptures clearly state in verse 4 that David did not violate her purity. For we read, the king knew her not. Now, we come to verses 5 through 10, and here we find, once again, a usurper. And again, it is Adonijah, the usurper son. Now, 1 Chronicles 29 describes the glorious coronation of Solomon as Israel's king, and we'll look at that later. But here we find also in chapter 29 of 1 Chronicles, David's prayer of intercession for his son. However, 1 Kings 1 provides a tragic background that led to David's decision to declare Solomon as God's chosen successor as king. Now, the sad events that we'll notice in 1 Kings 1 and 2 remind us again of the prophet Nathan's warning after David's adultery with Bathsheba and the death of Uriah, her husband, where the prophet said, "The sword shall never depart from thine house." 2 Samuel 12 and verse 10. Well, Adonijah, knowing his father's health was failing, he was now the oldest son of David and the brother of the deceased rebel Absalom. And he planned to seize his father's throne before he died. Now we're once again reminded of a common weakness in David's character as a father and his failure to address the sins within his household. As with Absalom, so it was with Adonijah. We read, "For his father had not displeased, that is, hurt or grieved or chastened him," that is Adonijah, "at any time in saying, Why hast thou done so?" It's very interesting. So in a sense, Adonijah had never known the rebuke of his father. So here we have this self-centered, self-serving son that now in the last days of his father's reign rises up against him. Now, Adonijah failed to show fear and respect for his father. He usurped the throne before the king's death, and he conspired with members of David's inner circle who, knowing the king was old and frail, seized the opportunity to ally themselves with Adonijah. Among the traitors who sided with Adonijah was Joab, verse 7 and 8, the captain of David's army, a powerful man in Israel. Now, you might remember, he had been beside David throughout his reign. But don't forget, this same Joab had been involved in David's orders to abandon Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba, and leave him on the battlefront to be killed. That was recorded in 2 Samuel 11. Now, although Joab was one of David's mighty men in the past, he had disparaged the king's will, and we remember he had slain 2 of his generals. Well, I would suggest to you as you look at verse 10, what I describe as a case for rebel radar. Now, like the rebels I have known, Adonijah had a keen sense, a rebel radar, of men who would be disloyal to his father, the king, and others to whom he dared not reveal his plot and aspirations to become king. Adonijah knew his actions went against his father's will, and he made sure that those loyal to David were not included in his plot. Among those, Adonijah had excluded, in verse 10, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah, and the mighty men, and Solomon, the brother of Adonijah. Well, verse 11 through 31 gives us a record of the intervention of the prophet Nathan and Bathsheba as they come to David. And so when the prophet Nathan learned of Adonijah's plot to seize the throne, he counseled, the prophet did, with Bathsheba to speak with the king on behalf of her son and to ask David to make Solomon king. Now Nathan assured Bathsheba that he would follow her and reinforce her appeal for David to intervene and foil Adonijah's insurrection. And so in verse 21, Bathsheba pleaded with David, and I quote, "It shall come to pass, when my lord the king shall sleep with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon shall be counted offenders." You see, Bathsheba feared, and rightly so, that as Adonijah would assassinate anyone he believed was a threat to his claim to the throne. Well, David summoned Bathsheba after hearing Nathan's report on how Adonijah plotted to become king in verse 23 through 27. And the king assured Bathsheba that Solomon, her son, would be king and would reign after him and shall sit upon my throne in my stead. Even so will I certainly do this day. Verse 30. Well, verse 32 through 40, we find the command for Solomon to be crowned king. So David did indeed heed Bathsheba's intercession, and following the prophet Nathan's counsel, he commanded Solomon to be anointed king and announced his successor before all Israel. That brings us to Adonijah's fear and plea for mercy, verse 41 through 53. So when news reached Adonijah that Solomon had been anointed king and everyone who followed him fled, well, fearing his brother might seek his life, Adonijah, we read in verse 50, escaped to the tabernacle. He grabbed the altar to plead for mercy. The son told Solomon that his brother had taken, quote, hold on the horns of the altar, saying, let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not slay his servant with the sword. Solomon, in an act of mercy, declared concerning Adonijah in verse 52, if he will show himself a worthy man, there shall not a hair of him fall to the earth. But if wickedness shall be found in him, he shall die. And so in verse 53, so King Solomon sent, and they brought Adonijah down from the altar. And he came, and he bowed himself to his brother, King Solomon. And Solomon said unto him, go to thine house. Well, a closing thought for this first chapter of 1 Kings. Adonijah received a reprieve from the death penalty he deserved because his act was an act of treason. However, Adonijah's hypocrisy and his wicked character would soon compel Solomon to act decisively to prevent civil war. Well, we're going to stop our study there and invite you to consider moving on to the next video, 1 Kings chapter 2, and we'll continue to follow the unfolding of the plot of those who tried to usurp Solomon, the new king of Israel. God bless, and bye-bye.